Quortnee Jones, and today we have Professor West. So, Professor West, this year marks the 125th year of a legendary past. Tell us about your connection to the history of Savannah State University, as well as how many years you've been associated with that history and in what roles.
Well, Quortnee, thank you very much for having me here on the program today. And that question would take quite a while to answer, but I'll try to fill in. My association with Savannah State actually started almost 40 years ago. Next year, the class of 1976, of which I am a proud member, will celebrate its 40th reunion anniversary. And as a student, I came here as a scared, timid young girl, 17 years old, out of high school, a new graduate, and had to be literally walked around by my cousin who had already graduated, Mr. Leroy West, and to actually show me buildings, how to get started on financial aid, to introduce me to key people here on campus, to sort of keep an eye on me. And so that started my role as a student, as a work-study student, major in the program of English language and literature. I was one of the first students in the program for mass communications, which was a minor at the time. Professor Charles Elmore, now Dr. Charles Elmore, started that program with our class in the mid-70s. And so there were a number of things. I worked on the Tigers Roar, on the student yearbook committee. I also ran unsuccessfully for student government president, but it was a great lesson in campus politics and community service, and I enjoyed that as well. During that time, Savannah State was being threatened. Perhaps that's a harsh word, but threatened with merging with a nearby university. We thought it was very important that the identity, the history of Savannah State College at that time be maintained as a historically black college. And I was one of the one of the students who helped to organize our protest against that. And so it was a very good, I would say, 40 years. And so I've gone from student to quiet student to activist, and now to a full-time permanent faculty member.
And as an alumnus, how do you connect the past to the present, as far as transitioning from student to faculty member?
I try to live up to the role of a person who is responsible, who values those things from the past. In the past, our students here, I think, had a sense of strong scholarship. The work here certainly had a bit of rigor to it. We were responsible, and we had that spirit of perseverance. As an alumnus, I think it's very important that we carry that tradition on. I certainly try to instill it in my students, as you probably recall from sitting in one of my classrooms. Standards are very high, and I think we have to maintain that. And you can have high standards and relate that with critical kindness. You can be critical with your students in terms of their work that's produced, but do it with some concern, some genuine concern that student will come out and be one of the best, one who would live up to that motto that we normally use. You can get anywhere from here.
All right, thank you. And what does legendary means to you? And would you mind providing a few examples?
Oh, legendary. Well, Again, I think I would have to reflect on the history as I know it. It gets a little harsh when you think that I've been associated with Savannah State for almost 40 of its 125 years. I don't want to even do the math. But recently, for the homecoming celebration, I did reflect on legendary. And I thought about, I came up with a door decoration, legendary literati. How did I get where I am today? How did I get here in a classroom teaching English composition and African American literature to students here? And I would have to say that those professors from the past were certainly legendary in that department of English. Dr. Louetta C. Millage, Dr. Norman Benedict Elmore, Professor Charles Elmore, at the time, now Dr. Elmore. He was founder of our mass communications program as a minor. And if anyone knows Dr. Elmore, the standards were certainly high. That's legendary to me. I had a chance to work under or with the Southern Regional Press Institute, started by the legendary Wilton C. Scott. But I would have to have our listeners visualize a great, big, beautiful blue airplane that sits at the Tompkins LaRoche side of our campus as you're coming in from that end by the stadium. The plane that was flown by my classmate from 1976, Commander Donnie Cochran of Pelham, Georgia. You can get anywhere from here. He was the first African American to fly in the legendary Blue Angels, that wonderful aviation team. And so those are just a few of the examples, and I'm sure there are many more I'm missing. Dr. Robert Louis Stevenson, he's still active in the community. The late Sister Julie Mangione, who wore her habit and taught her classes in that. And so it was a pretty good time here in the 70s.
All right. And transitioning from your memories as a student to you now as a faculty member, what department are you a part of and what courses do you teach?
I'm in the Department of English, Languages, and Cultures, which is in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Dr. Michael Schroeder is the chair of that department, and Dr. Robert Smith is the dean. I teach a variety of courses, English 1101, English 1102. I've taught African American poetry and also African American literature.
All right, very busy. I see still pretty busy, very active as a faculty member.
Yes.
Now, from my understanding, you are now the coordinator of the Richard Wright Freedom Day celebrations at Savannah State University. Would you mind explaining how that came about?
Well, serendipity, I guess, chance. A few years ago, we lost Dr. Haynes Walton Jr., who was a part of that legendary past of Savannah State College. Phenomenal scholar in the social sciences, in history, in politics. He left Savannah State and went on to the University of Michigan. We got word that Dr. Walton had passed away unexpectedly, as far as I know. And that we did organize, Dr. Jamal Touré and others organized a memorial to him in front of Haynes Hall. And I was curious about what Dr. Walton had been doing since he left from here, and I also wanted to go back and reflect on some of his writings. And so I came across an article that he had written with Dr. Kenneth Jordan and a few others, Dr. Modibo Kadali, who was here on the faculty at the time. They had done a study of National Freedom Day. And I must admit, Quortnee, that I was not familiar with that celebration. And then to see all of the references to our major, Richard Robert Wright, founder, first president of Savannah State, or rather, Georgia State College, Industrial College for Colored Youth for 30 years, to see his role in bringing that commemoration about. And that set me on a research journey. At the same time, we had a Fall Institute, and our president, Dr. Dozier, had pointed out her theme for the year, and she said something about getting it right. And I did a play on words as an English person, and I said, well, maybe that will be my theme, my focus for teaching the composition classes this semester. And so I came up with, I started thinking that day, and Dr. David Smith got up and said something about Richard Wright and how we would focus on honoring him during that upcoming year. I think it was 2013. And I realized that, well, they're celebrating National Freedom Day all over the country. In some places, I think even outside of the U.S. In all of my research, I saw nothing that pointed to a celebration here at Savannah State University. And so, I guess being a little bold, I stood up during the Fall Institute and suggested that we start a celebration here of National Freedom Day. And I think there was consensus, and I just took it from there. Luckily, with the support of Dr. David Smith and others here on the campus, Professor Alex Barr helped me to organize the program. And that was that very first year. We had participation from the NROTC units. We just had cooperation across the board. We had students we finally we had that program organized. Student Affairs also was a partner with us, and it ended with a commemorative wreath that we laid at the bust of Richard Wright in front of Wright Hall. So it was a wonderful way to make learning in the classroom real, authentic assessment, because I tied that celebration to readings that we had in our textbook at the time. And as you look through all of the scholarly work on Richard Wright, the speeches that he had done himself, if you look back at that way that National Freedom Day was formed, the big ideas are liberation, cultural identity, social consciousness, civil rights, and critical thinking. All of those come out of that legacy of Richard Robert Wright. And in the classroom, I think it's important that as instructors here on this campus, steeped in history of persons like Richard Wright, a former slave who came out of bondage and just achieved so many things. And so we can do that when we're pulling and connecting Wright to people like Paulo Freire on critical consciousness. We can do that by looking at the writings of Haynes Walton and Dr. Modibo Kadali, Dr. Kenneth Jordan. And all of those would be available in our databases, readily available for students to read and connect. I think it's very important. We can't say that we want students to be independent and critical thinkers and not expose them to those readings that are going to raise consciousness. They have to be able to follow in the footsteps of a Richard Wright. Not perhaps on the same level. They may not be instrumental in bringing about legislation, but I think it starts within their own dorm rooms, within their own homes, where they are, within their families. And they should start to reflect on those values that we want to instill in them here at Savannah State.
All right, thank you. And how are you able to bridge the disciplines of history and English for this commemoration?
Well, again, I think it starts with the instructor. First of all, the instructor has to have an interest or knowledge of our history. I think it's very important. One of the things that came out of the Save Savannah State movement back in the 70s was that we wanted this institution to forever reflect that past. Ironically, as Major Wright was writing early in the at the early part of the 20th century, ironically, he at that time noticed that there had to be a consciousness about the makeup of the faculty. We welcome diversity, I'm sure, not speaking for the administration, but I do know that that is just the reality of our times. But at the same time, those who are standing at the head of a classroom, Major Wright thought that those faculty members should look like and share an identity with the students who were here at Georgia State at the time. And so I think it starts there with having something in common, having an affinity, even if the faculty is made up of diverse persons, and it is, that there has to be a shared consciousness about why they are here and who our students are. And so as an English instructor, I think making those connections is very important. It can be done through reflective writing, focus-free writes that I've developed, and finding readings that are highly interesting and relevant. That's the first rule of designing a curriculum or forming an assignment calendar, that the material has to be highly interesting and highly relevant. So it was one of my, I'm also a certified teacher. And so I just recall that from one of my curriculum and methods courses. And so here at Savannah State in our English department, we've had ways of reading as a textbook. Currently have academic inquiry, but if you look at the writings of Mary Louise Pratt on Arts of the Contact Zone, Anthony Appiah on race, Tommy Shelby, We Who Are Dark, and his 5 Modes of Blackness. There's research all around. In the database, you're going to find scholars such as June Patton writing on Richard Wright. And I think our students need to know a material like this. There are several others, but June Patton is one. And certainly I have to mention Mitch Catchum. He has a very lengthy essay that is entitled with a quote from Richard Wright, which I love. And that is that he was a beacon to oppressed peoples everywhere. It's entitled Major Richard R. Wright Sr., National Freedom Day and the Rhetoric of Freedom in the 1940s. This was Catchum's scholarly essay that was published by the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in July 2004. Readily available, I think it's in JSTOR. But as I said, I think it's important to make these connections between reading, writing, and research. And I think we have to do that mainly in our English classrooms. Although, as a part of our writing initiative, we should be writing across the curriculum. So even in the social science classes, there would be a way to do this as well. And it's a lot of fun. Students, I just love seeing the light bulbs go off when they learn these little facts about Richard Wright. I mean, just the narrative of his life is so compelling. The way he walked the 200 miles, or his mother did. And I often ask my students to start this off. How would you like it if your mom came into your room one day and said, "Get up, boy, we're about to walk 200 miles, you're going to school." You can imagine.
We'll have to talk about it.
Okay, we'd have to talk about it. Okay, but I think times were different then. We're thinking back to that time where this was the first generation of freedom for the former slaves. And so people like little Richard Wright didn't have a lot of choices. And hopefully he did share that dream. And he went way beyond maybe what his mother expected at that time. I think he was about 11 or 12 years old at the time they walked to that school.
Now, earlier you mentioned how the students, alumni, faculty members, we all abide by a very well-saying slogan that was created by founder Richard R. Wright, which is "Tell them we are rising." Now, today, we have a new marketing theme, which is smart, bold, and proud. What do you think Major R. Wright will feel about that slogan?
I get the impression that Major Wright, President Wright, was a very humble man. If I were to say, President Wright, you were smart, you were bold, you were proud, that he would perhaps be a little coy about it, but certainly that could have been applied to him then. What happened with that phrase, "Tell them we are rising"? It was adapted from a poem that was written by the American poet John Greenleaf Whittier, who witnessed Wright saying this with his friend General Howard at the school in Atlanta. Oh. At age 67, he resigned and went on to Philadelphia to live with his son, who also became legendary. And I'm hoping that we will start to talk about him. I don't know if they do, especially in the Department of Social Work. Richard R. Wright Jr. was the first black to esteem himself in the area of social work, getting a PhD. So that too was a smart, bold, proud move. And he was a student here under his father. And so Wright moves to Philadelphia to live with him. He is responsible for this philosophy of the black social gospel, using the church as a base to help uplift the former slaves and people of African American descent. Wright is 67 years old when he takes on this new identity. He goes back to college at the Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania. And it's just phenomenal, the things, the energy that he had. And I think he would agree that both slogans, both mantras have served us well. And I'm anticipating great responses to smart, bold, and proud. We are Savannah proud.
So do you think that smart, bold, proud is more modernized as well as describe the ending chapters of Richard Wright legacy?
When I think about it, I think they overlap. If we had started using smart, bold, proud 125 years ago, it would still be true. It would have been true then. It is true now. Tell them we are rising. And I love that Whittier recorded this little boy's actual words, which were, tell them we are rising. All right? He didn't speak it as an educated person. And so there was, he wrote it in the vernacular as used by Richard Wright, which makes the poem so authentic. We get this eyewitness report of these little kids gathering around, and no one is bold enough to speak to the big general who's coming to inspect them. But little Richard Wright is the one that is bold, that does step up and looks into the eyes of this general, this white general, and says, "Sir, tell them we are rising." All right? And I can just perhaps infer the shock of the general and others there. Whittier certainly had to be impressed for him to have written it down and used it in his poem. It is in quotation marks in the poem. So that tells me he was struck at the time and he wrote it down. As writers, as poets, that's what we do. We notice something. We take a little word or phrase and we write it down and we save it for later. And good on him for the inspiration. So it inspired and led Savannah State for a number of years. When I came back as a full-time, temporary faculty at the time, I saw the big banner outside Hill Hall. And yes, it's inspirational. And so now we have a new generation of students to inspire, and the words are just as valuable, I think.
Thank you. And as we move towards Founders Day 2015, what is the takeaway for you as a teaching alumnus?
Oh, wow. The takeaway for me as a teaching alumnus is to forever feel a responsibility for how Savannah State has been instrumental in my life. I am blessed to have been in the classroom for about 29 years now. I have been able to travel. I have been published, or I am published, and I continue to work. I am a lifelong scholar. So, like Richard Wright, late in life, I'm pursuing my doctorate in English language, English criticism, literature and criticism, from a university in the north that only accepts the top 15%. And I'm very proud to say that as an alumnus from Savannah State College, that I got in, accepted, and I persevered. It is a tough program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, but I'm working through it, and I'm determined that I'm going to be successful with God's help.
Amen. Well, congratulations. Wish you much success. And I have a few more questions.
Okay.
So as Savannah State University becomes more diverse, how are they able to maintain their identity as a historically black college or university?
I think we continue to welcome students from all over the world. I think that we continue to learn from them, and faculty members as well. So it's maintaining that we are all on the same page, that our faculty and staff are conscious of this history from whence we have come, out of a concern to make things right, to create an opportunity for the children of former slaves to get an education under the Reconstruction Act. That was one of the outcomes. We were created as a land-grant college. And there were about 5 or 6 things under the Reconstruction Act in 1867. But to make sure that we continue to have a focus on civil rights, natural rights, education, citizenship, all of those things. And I don't think that's changed in the 125 years. And so, as an alumnus, what do? I maintain membership in my National Alumni Association because that's the way to pay it forward, to give back. And that's done, mostly in terms of time and participation in activities. As a member of the Savannah State University Community Booster Club, that's a way to support our athletes who have excelled on the fields, on the courts, wherever, and also in the classroom. So we have to make sure that there's a balance there. So I think as an alumnus, it's making sure that we stay intact as an HBCU, whatever it takes to do that. See, everything connects to something. And students are just, making these connections, and I'm glad to see that. So the same thing goes here for Savannah State University, the College by the Sea. There have been so many things to describe Savannah State, and so everybody has something to write about, whether it's the estuaries, the marshland. You're looking at it using the lens of a scientist. You're looking at that same marsh poetically, looking at the beauty, writing something in that way. So there's something for everybody here, and I just think that there are a lot of takeaways. And each college that is represented here perhaps has a responsibility to make sure that our stories continue for the next 125 years. And you do that by making sure your college is successful, that it is producing. Otherwise, we don't want to see anything lost. And I think it's working towards maintaining great history and a great reputation. And, we have some things to overcome, but we are going to overcome. And I think Major Richard Wright, President Wright, would be very proud.
Well, thank you, Professor West, for your time. It is very apparent that you care about your students, and we hope to have more professors such as yourself for the next 125 years.
Oh, thank you so much. But, I have to give credit where credit is due, and it's not all me. So honor goes much higher. And I thank you for having me on the program today, Quortnee. Ms. Jones?
Yes, ma'am.